Please just tell me your name and spell it as you'd like it to appear.
Yeah, Byron Scott, Byron Scott.
Is there any title, professionally or personally, you'd like to appear beneath your name?
Journalist.
Great. Byron, tell me a little bit about your family history and some of the people in your family tree.
Well, on my father's side, they go back to sort of North Carolina. I trace them back to the early 1800s in North Carolina. They moved from North Carolina. Some of them stayed there for a long time, but many of them moved up to Baltimore at some point, and then to New Jersey, where I was born in 1959. On my mother's side, I could trace them back to Warrenton, Virginia, and on her father's side to Puerto Rico.
Got it.
Yeah, in 1845.
Wow. And in terms of the Old Harmony Cemetery, Columbian Harmony Cemetery,
Mm-hmm.
any family members that were entombed there?
There's one relative, the people who adopted my great-grandmother in the 1800s rather, adopted her. They are from D.C., and they're buried in Harmony. His name is George Johnson Beans.
Wow.
He was born in D.C. in 1824 and died in D.C. 1898.
And anything you discovered about his life or his legacy?
Well, out of all the research I've done on the family, his is the longest list that I have. I mean, he was, again, born in 1824 in Washington, D.C. He was in the Navy, was in the U.S.-Mexican War. He worked as a hydrologist at some point. He served twice in the Navy. 1865, he enlisted again. He was a barber, a laborer, a messenger, and again, he died in 1898.
Any thoughts on, had you ever been to the New Harmony Cemetery, and what did you know about the Old Harmony Cemetery?
Well, what happened was, how it all started was I was looking at information about my great-grandmother, and her name was Vietta Reeves Sims. But I hit a deadlock, and then a wall. And then at some point, looking through some old paper my father had, I saw her name with the name Gray inserted as a last name. And when I started looking for Gray, that's when I located the Beans. She was living with George and Josephine Beans in D.C., and that's how I was able to sort of find out about them. And so, yeah. And so what happened was I found his death certificate. 1898, he died and was buried in Harmony, and that's why I went there to the new one to see where he's buried, but there's no headstone there. And later on, I found out about the Old Harmony Cemetery, and that's when I started putting it all together.
That's amazing, and this is a story we've heard time and time again before, but especially today, that family members went to New Harmony, like, oh, this is where my ancestors buried, and they got there and were just confounded to see just basically green fields,
right,
and a few small plaques, but a lot of these graves were unmarked.
Yeah, I know the section where he's buried, but there's no stone there.
Yeah.
So I was told that when they just moved the body, they just sort of heaved them in, and some of them they don't know who's in which grave.
Yeah, and certainly the research has shown there's been certainly mass grave areas, and that the Columbia Harmony, the Old Harmony these are beautiful stones. People
Yes.
spent, families were doing well and spent a lot of money to memorialize, their parents and their grandparents, and this was just cast away when they
Right.
decided these land developers decided, oh, well, we're going to change the landscape here.
Right. Yeah, I first learned about that cemetery in the Washington Post. They did an article several years ago about the Old Harmony, and I had been, of course, in that area near Rhode Island Avenue, the metro station. And so I learned about it. And we've done a couple of stories here about the cemetery, and that's how I met Lex, doing stories about the cemetery. He and I came in contact. And so I mentioned to him that I had a relative buried there, and he said, well, let's stay in contact.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, we pulled out over 50 stones, but certainly there'll be a much bigger operation with big machines to pull out whatever else can be found. We're talking about over 38,000 individuals were entombed there, and obviously very big, very ornate, very beautiful stones. So it'll be very interesting to find out if perhaps we find.
Yeah, I sure hope so. I talked again with Lex, and he mentioned that they could not find a headstone for him yet, which doesn't mean there's none there. I know after he passed away in 1898, the family moved to Jersey City, and that's where I was born, many years later, of course. But so I'm not sure anyone else is buried there from the family but him.
Got Got it. And it was what year?
1898, September.
1898.
I believe it was September 20th, 1898 is when he died.
So I think a lot of that goes to what are the stones made of? You
Right.
know, it's certainly the granite stones that came out look like they were carved yesterday.
Right.
But certainly we're talking about limestone and some of these other materials. They're much softer, and they will feel more the effects of the weather.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, it would be so fantastic to find the original stone. And if the stone is pulled from the river, what do you think you would do with it?
Well, that's a good question. I hadn't quite thought about that. I'd like to see it put up in the New Harmony Cemetery. I'd love to see that and just bring the family over there to look at it. Because I'm the only one in the family that does the real research. Most of them watch me doing the research and applaud when I'm done. But I think that'll be a great moment. Yeah, for the family.
And you've done several stories, on these this situation. What are your thoughts about how this cemetery was moved, and is it part of a bigger narrative of Washington D.C. history, of not only communities but of memorial areas being uprooted and moved to other places that were more convenient?
Well, I think it's part of a larger history. I think that it speaks to not just the soul of D.C. at the time, but a soul of the United States. You have this what's considered a sacred ground that was desecrated, stones knocked over. The city at one time, I think, used to park its trucks there, and then they just uprooted the graves and moved them out. Sort of, as I understand it, helter-skelter sort of way out to Maryland. Someone bought the land, for an investment, and they moved all. So it's a shame that it happened, and I'm glad someone is doing something to bring it to life.
And I certainly think, as our research is showing, this is not necessarily an unusual act. It's not really, in a lot of cases, the exception, where you're like, this isn't terrible. This is, a lot of cemeteries are moved when it's like, okay, well, who else is left to,
Right.
Pay homage to the individuals who are buried here? Okay, well, that's been 2 generations.
Right.
Oh, maybe we can build a mall.
It happens. It happens. But again, not just here. I think it's happened around the country with cemeteries of people of color. They get forgotten about, the headstones, and developer walks in and takes, the stones are mowed over, and then there's a big box store on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you like to see? What would you like to see happen with this project going forward? Do you have any interest in terms of things that, like, well, this is. You've seen where it's gone so far. Where would you like to see this project or projects like it?
Well, for me, I hope it leads to more research. The one thing you find out about research is you never get enough of it. You like discovering new things, new lessons, and I hope it leads to something else. I've been, researching the family now since 2008, and I thought I could get over it in just a month or two. But the more you do, the more you want to do. So I hope it leads to more research and more discoveries about the family.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think, you've been at the forefront of doing your own research, but I think these types of interviews could be inspiring to other families to really say, what, the information is out there. It's not easy to find, but, doing your own research is really a beautiful thing.
Well, I tell people, you need patience, perseverance, and time. It doesn't come easily. You'll do research and you'll make a million discoveries, and all of a sudden you hit a brick wall, and you'll stop for a while, and all of a sudden, the machine's running again, and you're able to get more research done and find some new information. I mean, recently I discovered more information about my great-grandfather that I did not know until within the last month, about his work history and where he lived at what point in time. So you always, if you love making your discoveries, I would recommend it to people, but just make sure you have time and perseverance.
Keep digging.
Yeah, and leave no stone unturned. I mean, again, with my great-grandmother that led me to George Beans, had I not found that letter with the name Gray on it, I wouldn't have been led to him. And I had never heard that name before. And of course I said, well, let me type this and see what happens. And all of a sudden, boom, it took me to D.C., it took me to the family, and ultimately what happened to him when he died, and they moved to New Jersey.
Wow. Anything just about the history of Washington, D.C., especially in terms of the African American community. Anything you could say about the significance of that city in particular?
Regarding?
Just really as it being a center of, there's a lot of very successful people of color going back towards, Columbia Harmony Cemetery, and these were a massive cemetery, and these were some, very important historic individuals. and how Washington, D.C. really, and the surrounding area, was a hub of that type of activity.
Well, I think you can look at Washington, you look at Philadelphia. A lot of big cities had a lot of big black populations that were successful. I think this helps to solidify that history, or at least bring it to light, because it puts it in print, in your case on film or tape. And I think these things are very, very important. But I think, D.C. had a wealth of knowledge of black people in science and music, arts, and I think, the military, and I think this cemetery and getting to know who's in there and history is helpful.
And have you noticed anything in recent years, or even just in terms of the changing demographics of D.C.?
Well, I'm not from D.C. I've only been there a handful of years. But in that short period of time, I mean, it's changed. My wife talks about, if you came here 5 years ago, it would look totally different. So I mean, it's like any city gentrifying. It just, there's a big change. Some folks move in, some get pushed out, and hopefully the stories don't get pushed out with them. Yeah.
Absolutely. Anything else you'd like to say, really, in closing, just about your story, your research, your family?
I'll probably think of all the good stuff after you guys leave. That's usually how it works. I mean, I just think this is an important project. I think it's important to bring it to the fore. I would love to know the names of all the people who are buried there, and had that memorial set up in their honor. But just the stories, and just who's in there, and if I have other relatives there as well.
Absolutely, and that is one of the the designs for the memorial, is to have a wall that has all over 38,000 names on it, so folks don't have to go digging in the archives, or it's like you can just kind of walk and look at names,
right?
And
right.
by alphabetical order, and
right. You
never know how you're going to connect the dots, and apply it to either your own life or a friend's life, or and all suddenly, like you say, never stop, no stone unturned.
Right, and as I said, he adopted my great grandmother, but were it not for him and his wife, then events wouldn't have happened the same way. And so again, when he passed away, they moved to New Jersey, which is where I was born. And then, oddly enough, the daughter that they adopted my grandmother. So I'm twice down the adoption line here. Wow. And so had events not happened the way they did with them, I wouldn't, probably wouldn't be here.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. Well, that's really it. If there's anything else you want to say, please, we'd love to hear it. But that's really just a little brief discussion about.
Yeah, I'm trying to think now. Again, he lived there from 1824 to 1898. I have a photograph of the ship that he or it's an illustration, the ship that he served on in the war. Photograph of the house where he lived. I have a photograph in my great grandmother's box, but I don't know if that's him or not. I suspect it may be him because of the uniform that he had on.
Yeah.
But I can't say with certainty that it's him or not.
And what war was that?
Well, he was in his wife got a pension that says U.S.-Mexican War. And she was receiving a pension from that when he died.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as I said afterwards, we'd love to see some of these documents. And,
yeah, I can email them to you. The ship,
please.
One of the ships was called the Water Witch, but one was called the Independence. And I think I have illustrations of both of those, so I can send you those.